Chapter 4. No regrets? Silk asked Garion that evening as they rode toward the sharply rising peaks outlined against the glittering stars ahead. Regrets about what? Giving up command. Silk had been watching him curiously ever since the setting sun had signaled the resumption of their journey. No, Garion replied, not quite sure what the little man meant. Why should there be? It's a very important thing for a man to learn about himself, Garion, Silk told him seriously. Power can be very sweet for some men, and you never know how a man's going to handle it until you give him the chance to try. I don't know why you went to all the trouble. It's not too likely that I'm going to be put in charge of things very often. You never know, Garion. You never know. They rode on across the barren black sands of the wasteland, toward the mountains looming ahead. The quarter moon rose behind them, and its light was cold and white. Near the edge of the wasteland there was a few scrubby thorn bushes huddling low to the sand and silvered with frost. It was an hour or so before midnight when they finally reached rocky ground, and the hooves of their horses clattered sharply as they climbed up out of the sandy waste. When they topped the first ridge, they stepped to look back. The dark expanse of the wasteland behind them was dotted with the watchfires of the Murgos, and far back along their trail they saw moving torches. I was starting to worry about that, Silk said to Belgrath, but it looks as if they found our trail after all. Let's hope they don't lose it again, the old man replied. Not too likely, really. I made it pretty obvious. Murgos can be a bit unpredictable sometimes. Belgrath seemed to have recovered almost completely, but Gary noted a weary slump to his shoulders and was glad that they did not plan to ride all night. The mountains into which they rode were as arid and rocky as the ones lying to the north had been. There were looming cliffs and patches of alkali on the ground, and a bitingly cold wind that seemed to wail endlessly through the rocks and to tug at the coarse woven Murgo robes that disguised them. They pushed on until they were well into the mountains. Then, several hours before dawn, they stopped to rest and to wait for the sun to rise. When the first faint light appeared on the eastern horizon, Silk rode out and located a rocky gap passing the northwest between the two orcherous cliff faces. As soon as he returned, they saddled their horses again and moved out at a trot. We can get rid of these now, I think, Belgrath said, pulling off his Murgo robe. I'll take them, Silk suggested as he reined in. The gap's just ahead there, he pointed. I'll catch up in a couple hours. Where are you going? Varric asked him. I'll leave a few miles more of false trail, Silk replied. Then I'll double back and make sure that you haven't left any tracks. It won't take long. You want some company? The big man offered. Silk shook his head. I can move faster alone. Be careful. Silk grinned. I'm always careful. He took the Murgo garments from them and rode off to the west. The gap into which they rode appeared to be the bed of a stream that had dried up thousands of years before. The water had cut through the rock, revealing layer upon layer of red, brown, and yellow stone lying in bands, one atop the other. The sound of their horses' hoofs was very loud as they clattered along between the cliffs, and wind whistled as it poured through the cut. Taiba drew her horse in beside Garion's. She was shivering, and she had the cloak he had given her pulled tightly about her shoulders. Is it always this cold? She asked, her large violet eyes very wide. In the winter time, he replied. I imagine it's pretty hot here in the summer. The slave pens were always the same, she told him. We never knew what season it was. The twisting stream bed made a sharp bend to the right, and they rode into the light of the newly risen sun. Taiba gasped. What's wrong? Garen asked her quickly. The light, she cried, covering her face with her hands. It's like fire in my eyes. Relg, who rode directly in front of them, was also shielding his eyes. He looked back over his shoulder at the Merag woman. Here, he said. He took one of the veils he usually bound across his eyes when they were in direct sunlight and handed it back to her. Cover your eyes with this until we're back into the shadows again. His voice was peculiarly neutral. Thank you, Taiba said, binding the cloth across her eyes. I didn't know the sun could be so bright. You'll get used to it, Relg told her. It takes some time. Try to protect your eyes for the first few days. He seemed about to turn and ride on. Then he looked at her curiously. Haven't you ever seen the sun before? He asked her. No, she replied. Other slaves told me about it, though. The Murgos don't use women on their work gangs, so I was never taken out of the pens. It was always dark down there. It must have been terrible, Garion shuddered. She shrugged. The dark wasn't so bad. It was the light we were afraid of. Light meant that Murgos were coming with torches to take someone to the temple to be sacrificed. The trail they followed turned again, and they rode out of the bright glare of sunlight. Thank you, Taiba said to Relg, removing the veil from her eyes and holding it out to him. Keep it, he told her. You'll probably need it again. His voice seemed oddly subdued, and his eyes had a strange gentleness in them. As he looked at her, the haunted expression crept back over his face. Since they had first left Rakthal, Garen had covertly watched these two. He knew that Relg, despite all his efforts, could not take his eyes off the Marag woman he had been forced to rescue from living entombment in the caves. Although Relg still ranted about sin continually, his words no longer carried the weight of absolute conviction. Indeed, quite often they seemed to be little more than a mechanical repetition of a set of formulas. Occasionally, Garion had noted, even those formulas had faltered when Tava's deep violet eyes had turned to regard the Ulgo's face. For her part, Tava was quite obviously puzzled. Relg's rejection at her simple gratitude had humiliated her, and her resentment had been hot and immediate. His constant scrutiny, however, spoke to her with a meaning altogether different from the words coming from his lips. His eyes told her one thing, but his mouth said something else. She was baffled by him, not knowing whether to respond to his look or his words. "You've lived your whole life in the dark, then?" Relg asked her curiously. "Most of it," she replied. "I saw my mother's face once, the day the Murgos came and took her to the temple. I was alone after that. Being alone is the worst of it. You can bear the dark if you aren't alone." "How old were you when they took your mother away?" "I don't really know. I must have been almost a woman, though, because not long after that the Murgos gave me to a slave who had pleased them. There were a lot of slaves in the pens who did anything the Murgos wanted, and they were rewarded with extra food, or with women. I cried at first, but in time I learned to accept it. At least I wasn't alone anymore." Relg's face hardened, and Taba saw the expression. "What should I have done?" she asked him. "When you're a slave, your body doesn't belong to you. They can sell you or give you to anybody they want to, and there's nothing you can do about it." "There must have been something." "Such as what?" "I didn't have any kind of weapon to fight with, or to kill myself with, and you can't strangle yourself." She looked at Garion. "Did you know that? Some of the slaves tried it, but all you do is fall into unconsciousness, and then you start to breathe again. Isn't that curious?" "Did you try to fight?" It seemed terribly important to Relg for some reason. What would have been the point? The slave they gave me to was stronger than I. He'd have just hit me until I did what he wanted. "You should have fought," Relg declared adamantly. "A little pain is better than sin, and giving up like that is sin." "Is it? If somebody forces you to do something and there's no possible way to avoid it, is it really sin?" Relg started to answer, but her eyes looking directly into his face seemed to stop up his tongue. He faltered, unable to face that gaze. Abruptly, he turned his mount and rode back toward the pack animals. "Why does he fight with himself so much?" Taba asked. "He's completely devoted to his god," Garen explained. "He is afraid of anything that might take away some of what he feels he owes to Ul." "Is this Ul of his really that jealous?" "No, I don't think so, but Relg does." Taba pursed her lips in a sensual pout, and looked back over her shoulder at the retreating zealot. "You know," she said, "I think he's actually afraid of me." She laughed then, that same low, wicked little laugh, and lifted her arms to run her fingers through the glory of her midnight hair. "No one's ever been afraid of me before, not ever. I think I rather like it. Will you excuse me?" She turned her horse without waiting for a reply, and quite deliberately rode back after the fleeing Relg. Garion thought about it as he rode on through the narrow, twisting canyon. He realized that there was a strength in Taba that none of them had suspected, and he finally concluded that Relg was in for a very bad time. He trotted on ahead to speak to Aunt Paul about it as she rode with her arms around Erend. "It's really none of your business, Garion," she told him. "Relg and Taiba can work out their problems without any help from you." I was just curious, that's all. Relg's tearing himself apart, and Taiba's all confused about him. What's really going on between them, Aunt Paul? Something very necessary, she replied. You could say that about nearly everything that happens, Aunt Paul. It was almost an accusation. You could even say that about the way Sinadra and I quarrel all the time is necessary too, couldn't you? She looked slightly amused. It's not exactly the same thing, Garion, she answered, but there's a certain necessity about that too. That's ridiculous, he scoffed. Is it really? Then why do you suppose the two of you go out of your way to so much to aggravate each other? He had no answer for that, but the entire notion worried him. At the same time, the very mention of Sinedra's name suddenly brought her sharply into his mind, and he realized that he actually missed her. He rode along in silence behind Aunt Paul for a while, feeling melancholy. Finally, he sighed. And why so great a sigh? It's all over, isn't it? What's that? This whole thing, I mean. We've recovered the orb. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? There's more to it than that, Carrion. Much more. And we're not out of Cthol Murgos yet, are we? You're not really worried about that, are you? But then, as if her question had suddenly uncovered some lingering doubts in his own mind, he stared at her in sudden apprehension. What would happen if we didn't? He blurted. If we didn't make it out, I mean. What would happen to the West if we didn't get the orb back to Riva? Things would become unpleasant. There'd be war, wouldn't there? And the Angarax would win, and there'd be Grollems everywhere with their knives and the altars. The thought of Grollems marching up to the gates of Falder's farm outraged him. Don't go borrowing trouble, Garion. Let's worry about one thing at a time, shall we? But what if, Garion, she said with a pained look, don't belabor the what-ifs, please. If you start that, you'll just worry everybody to death. You say what if to grandfather all the time, he accused. That's different, she replied. They rode hard for the next several days through a series of passes with the dry, bitter chill pressing at them like some great weight. Silk rode back often to look for any signs of pursuit, but their ruse seemed to have fooled the Murgos. Finally, about noon on a cold, sunless day, when the wind was kicking up dust clouds along the horizon, they reached the broad, arid valley through which the south caravan route wound. They took cover behind a low hill, while Silk rode on ahead to take a quick look. Thinkest thou that Tar Urgath hath joined in the search for us? Mandaralin, dressed again in his armor, asked Belgarath. It's hard to say for sure, the old sorcerer replied. He's a very unpredictable man. There's a Murgo patrol headed east on the caravan route, Silk reported when he returned. It'll be another half hour or so until they're out of sight. Belgarath nodded. Do you think we'll be safe once we cross into Mishrak Cthol? Dernick asked. We can't count on it, Belgarath replied. Cthol, the king of the Thuls, is afraid of Tar Urgas, so he wouldn't make any kind of fuss about a border dispute if Tar Urgas decided to follow us. They waited until the Murgos had crossed the low ridge to the east, and then moved out again. For the next 2 days they rode steadily to the northwest. The terrain grew less rocky after they crossed into the land of the Thuls, and they saw the telltale dust clouds far behind them that spoke of mounted Murgo search parties. It was late in the afternoon of a murky day when they finally reached the top of the eastern escarpment. Barrick glanced back over his shoulder at the dust clouds behind them, then pulled his horse in beside Belgarath's. Just how rough is the ground leading down into the vale? He asked. It's not the easiest trail in the world. Those Murgos are less than a day behind us, Belgarath. If we have to pick our way down, they'll be on top of us before we make it. Belgarath pursed his lips, squinting at the dust clouds on the southern horizon. Perhaps you're right, he said. Maybe we'd better think this through. He raised his hand to call a halt. It's time to make a couple decisions, he told the rest of them. The Murgos are a little closer than we really want them to be. It takes 2 to 3 days to make the descent into the Vale, and there are places where one doesn't want to be rushed. We could always go on to that ravine we followed coming up, Silk suggested. It only takes a half day to go down that way. But Lord Hedda and the Algar clans of Chohag await us in the Vale, Mandaralin objected. Were we to go on, would we not lead the Murgos down into undefended country? Have we got any choice? Silk asked him. We could light fires along the way, Beric suggested. Hedar will know what they mean. So would the Murgos, Silk said. They'd ride all night and be right up behind us every step of the way down. Belgarath scratched sourly at his short white beard. I think we're going to have to abandon the original plan, he decided. We have to take the shortest way down, and that means the ravine, I'm afraid. We'll be on our own once we get down, but that can't be helped. Surely King Chohag will have scouts posted along the foot of the escarpment, Dernick said, his plain face worried. We can hope so, Beric replied. All right, Belgrass said firmly. We'll use the ravine. I don't altogether like the idea, but our options seem to have narrowed a bit. Let's ride. It was late afternoon when they reached the shallow gully at the top of the steep notch leading down to the plain below. Belgarath glanced once down the precipitous cut and shook his head. Not in the dark, he decided. Can you see any signs of algars? He asked Beric, who was staring out at the plain below. I'm afraid not, the red-bearded man answered. Do you want to light fire to signal them? No, the old man replied. Let's not announce our intentions. I will need a small fire, though, Aunt Paul told him. We all need a hot meal. I don't know if that's wise, Polgara, Belgarath objected. We'll have a hard day tomorrow, father, she said firmly. Derek knows how to build a small fire and keep it hidden. Have it your way, Paul, the old man said in a resigned tone of voice. Naturally, father. It was cold that night, and they kept their fire small and well sheltered. As the first light of dawn began to stain the cloudy sky to the east, they rode and prepared to descend the rocky cut toward the plains below. I'll strike the tents, Dernick said. Just knock them down, Belgrath told him. He turned and nudged one of the packs thoughtfully with his foot. We'll take down only what we absolutely have to, he decided. We're not going to have the time to waste on these. You're not going to leave them? Dernick shouted, shocked. They'll just be in the way, and the horses will be able to move faster without them. But all of our belongings, Dernick protested. Silk also looked a bit chagrined. He quickly spread out a blanket and began rummaging through the packs, his quick hands bringing out innumerable small valuable items and piling them in a heap on the blanket. Where did you get all those? Beric asked him. Here and there, Silk replied evasively. You stole them, didn't you? Some of them, Silk admitted. We've been on the road for a long time, Beric. Do you really plan to carry all that down the ravine? Beric asked, curiously eyeing Silk's treasures. Silk looked at the heap, mentally weighing it. Then he sighed with profound regret. No, he said, I guess not. He stood up and scattered the heap with his foot. It's all very pretty, though, isn't it? Now I guess I'll have to start all over again. He grinned then. It's the stealing that's fun, anyway. Let's go down. And he started toward the top of the steeply descending stream bed that angled sharply down toward the base of the escarpment. The unburdened horses were able to move much more rapidly, and they all passed quite easily over spots Garen remembered painfully from the upward climb weeks before. By noon, they were more than halfway down. Then Polgara stopped and raised her face. Father, she said calmly, they found the top of the ravine. How many of them? It's an advance patrol, no more than 20. Far above, they heard a sharp clash of rock against rock, and then, after a moment, another. I was afraid of that, Belgrass said sourly. What? Garen asked. They're rolling rocks down on us, the old man grimly hitched up his belt. All right, the rest of you go on ahead. Get down as fast as you can. Are you strong enough, Father? Aunt Paul asked, sounding concerned. You still haven't really recovered, you know. We're about to find out, the old man replied, his face set. Move, all of you. He said it in a tone that cut off any possible argument. As they all began scrambling down over the steep rocks, Garion lagged farther and farther behind. Finally, as Dernick led the last pack horse over a jumble of broken stone and around a bend, Garion stopped entirely and stood listening. He could hear the clatter and slide of hooves on the rocks below, and from above the clash and bounce of a large stone tumbling over the ravine, coming closer and closer. Then there was a familiar surge and roaring sound. A rock, somewhat larger than a man's head, went whistling over him, angling sharply up out of the cut to fall harmlessly far out onto the tumbled debris at the floor of the escarpment. Carefully, Garion began climbing back up the ravine, pausing often to listen. Belgarath was sweating as Garion came into sight around a bend in the ravine a goodly way above, and ducked back out of the old man's sight. Another rock, somewhat larger than the first, came bounding and crashing down the narrow ravine, bouncing off the walls and leaping into the air each time it struck the rocky stream bed. About 20 yards above Belgarath, it struck solidly and spun into the air. The old man gestured irritably, grunting with the effort, and the rock sailed out in a long arc, clearing the walls of the ravine and falling out of sight. Garion quickly crossed the stream bed and went down several yards more, staying close against the rocky wall and peering back to be sure he was concealed from his grandfather. When the next rock came bouncing and clashing down toward them, Garion gathered his will. He'd have to time it perfectly, he knew, and he peered around a corner, watching the old man intently. When Belgarath raised his hand, Garion pushed his own will in to join his grandfather's, hoping to slip a bit of unnoticed help to him. Belgarath watched the rock go whirling far out over the plain below. Then he turned and looked sternly down the ravine. "All right, Garion," he said crisply. "Step out where I can see you." Somewhat sheepishly, Garion went out into the center of the stream bed and stood looking up at his grandfather. "Why is it that you can never do what you're told to do?" the old man demanded. "I just thought I could help, that's all." "Did I ask for help? Do I look like an invalid?" "There's another rock coming." "Don't change the subject. I think you're getting above yourself, young man." "Grandfather," Garion said urgently, staring at the large rock bounding down the ravine directly for the old man's back. He threw his will under the rock and hurled it out of the ravine. Belgarath looked up at the stone soaring over his head. "Tacky, Garion," he said disapprovingly. "Very tacky. You don't have to throw them all the way to Prolgu, you know. Stop trying to show off." "I got excited," Garion apologized. "I pushed a little too hard." The old man grunted. "All right," he said a bit ungraciously. "As long as you're here anyway, but stick to your own rocks. I can manage mine, and you throw me off balance when you come blundering in like that." "I just need a little practice, that's all." "You need some instruction in etiquette, too," Belgarath told him, coming on down to where Garion stood. "You don't just jump in with help until you're asked. That's very bad form, Garion." "Another rock coming," Garion informed him politely. "Do you want to get it, or shall I?" "Don't get snippy, young man," Belgarath told him, then turned and flipped the approaching rock out of the ravine. They moved on down together, taking turns on the rocks the Murgos were rolling down the ravine. Garion discovered that it grew easier each time he did it, but Belgarath was drenched with sweat by the time they neared the bottom. Garion considered trying once again to slip his grandfather a bit of assistance, but the old sorcerer glared at him so fiercely as he started to gather in his will that he quickly abandoned the idea. "I wondered where you'd gone," Aunt Paul said to Garion as the two clambered out over the rocks at the mouth of the ravine to rejoin the rest of the party. She looked closely at Belgarath. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm just fine," he snapped. "I had all this assistance. Unsolicited, of course." He glared at Garion again. "When we get a bit of time, we're going to have to give him some lessons in controlling the noise," she observed. "He sounds like a thunderclap." "That's not all he has to learn to control." For some reason, the old man was behaving as if he'd just been dreadfully insulted. "What now?" Beric asked. "Do you want to light signal fires and wait here for Hedda and Chohag?" "This isn't a good place, Beric," Silk pointed out. "Half of Murgodom's going to come pouring down the ravine very shortly." "The passage is not wide, Prince Keldar," Mandarin observed. "My Lord Beric and I can hold it for a week or more, if need be." "You're backsliding again, Mandarin," Beric told him. "Besides, they just roll rocks down on you," Silk said. "And they're going to be dropping boulders off the edge of up there before long. We're probably going to have to get out on the plain a ways to avoid that sort of thing." Drnik was staring thoughtfully at the mouth of the ravine. "We need to send something up there to slow them down, though," he mused. "I don't think we want them right behind us." "It's a little hard to make rocks roll uphill," Beric said. "I wasn't thinking of rocks," Drnik replied. We'll need something much lighter. Like what? Silk asked the smith. Smoke would be good, Dernick answered. The ravine should draw just like a chimney. If we built a fire and fill the whole thing with smoke, nobody's going to come down until the fire goes out. Silk grinned broadly. Dernick, he said, you're a treasure.